Hello everyone, how's it going? It is Tyrnor as always, and I'm here to bring you another top whatever list. This time it is the top 13 organizations. Now, an organization I define as pretty much anything from a state or a group of states to a militia or a tribe or a clan or something similar. Now, I would also like to mention that this list will feature an honorable mention just before we get to number 1, and I suppose here we go. Number 13 on my list might seem like an odd one. It is the Ramkahen. The Ramkahen are one of the free Tol'vir tribes, pretty much the only surviving tribe following the Cataclysm and all those shenanigans. And like I mentioned in an older video when I was talking with Necroxys about patch 6.2, one thing that I really like about Warcraft is the world building. And as a result, I really like the Ramkahen. And that's because Uldum as a zone and along with its quest lines is full of world building for the Ramkahen and the Tol'vir in general. Normally, in game, a civilization would usually consist of a main hub, plus some random ancillary stuff, but the Tol'vir society is really developed in Uldum, as we see farms, we see smaller towns, we see outposts, and along with the main city, and perhaps above all we have a fairly well organized political system. In addition, I also like the storyline of Uldum and the storyline that followed in the Quest of Pandaria series on how the Ramkahen dealt with never-set remnants, and all of that stuff makes it my number 13. Number 12 on my list is the Kingdom of Ahn'Qiraj. I feel like Ahn'Qiraj is a bit of a neglected part of lore, even though there is actually quite a lot of it. A lot of lore, I mean. I personally really like Ahn'Qiraj and how it was defined in the lore. I love the storyline of the War of the Shifting Sands, and really it's surprising how much Ahn'Qiraj was defined and detailed as a lore organization, especially considering it was vanilla. There's obviously the chain of command with K'Fun and the Twin Emperors at its head, but there are also quite a few individual stories within the kingdom. Obviously most of them evolved from the War of the Shifting Sands. From the stratagems, for instance, of General Rojax during the war, who managed to turn around its course before the dragons came to help the Night Elves, to the ingenuity of the Anubis Sappho Syrian, for instance, who was one of the few, if not only, combatants during the war who managed to actually kill a dragon. Really, unlike some of the other minions of the old gods, Ahn'Qiraj is obviously a very hierarchical, a very well-structured society, from the Twin Emperors themselves down to the very small Silithid hive. So yeah, Ahn'Qiraj. Number 11 on my list is the Exodar, or Velen's Draenei for lack of a better term. Like I mentioned many times before, I really like the Draenei. I like what they stand for, I pretty much like all individual characters, and I love Velen. However, I also like the political structure of the Draenei, of which we gained a bit of insight in Warlords of Draenor. Originally, on Draenor, the head of the Draenei society was obviously Prophet Velen, but the ones who ran the day-to-day business were the Council of Exarchs. After the orcs did their thing and the Draenei society was almost shattered, the absolute ruler of the Draenei society was now the Prophet Velen. Velen is not a despot though, and since he often spent time in meditation, the Triumvirate of the Hand, three of the Exodar's strongest paladins, became the de facto leaders of Draenei society. So it is quite an interesting political aspect. However, what I really like is how dependent the Draenei are now on their prophet. We see in Velen's short story that, in his absence, even though the Triumvirate is technically in charge, they are still extremely hesitant to make any sort of decisions without first consulting with their prophet. And I think that this stems from what happened to the Draenei on Draenor. In Warlords of Draenor, Velen, the prophet, dies and the Draenei are left without their head. However, the society still survives, I think, because it had not been damaged to its core by the Orcish Horde. I think that the slaughter the Draenei endured in our timeline pulled them much closer together and made them all the more dependent on their prophet, which can be a pretty bad thing again, as evidenced in Velen's short story, where the Triumvirate again refused to do anything. But there's also a very interesting Legion spoiler that you may have heard that solidifies my view. Number 10 on my list are the Argent Crusade. I really like its lore, obviously, the fight against the Lich King, and how it was in many ways the successful one, the successful result of the previous, crusades. I like the various characters within the crusade, I love its relationship with the Knights of the Ebon Blade, and I especially love that they're not, evil. There isn't really much left to say other than that I also like how well it was organized, even after the Northrend campaign, and that they're pretty much this awesome group who show up when they're needed, even if they no longer fight against the Lich King. Number 9 on my list is the Kingdom of Stormwind. I like Stormwind's story from before the First War to what it is in present times. I like the various political shenanigans after the Second War, and I especially liked what happened with the House of Nobles and the manipulations of Ahn'Qiraj, which led to the creation of the Defias Brotherhood, among other things. In many ways though, the Kingdom of Stormwind, following Varian's return before Wrath of the Lich King, is in a way the ideal that a medieval kingdom would aspire to, with the king obtaining control over the nobility, as seen in Variant's short story, and with strong support from the church. I also really like pretty much all of the characters from the Rin dynasty and their family dynamics, and I'm including Anduin on that list. Stormwind is just this cool, well-developed and interesting kingdom with plenty of interesting characters and great stories. Number 8 on my list is the Defias Brotherhood. Like I mentioned previously, I love the storyline of Ahn'Qiraj manipulating Stormwind and causing disorder, and the storyline of the Defias Brotherhood makes you really sympathize with them. The Defias were formed from the Masons who rebuilt Stormwind following the Second War, but who, when they asked to actually get paid for their work, were refused by the House of Nobles, manipulated by Ahn'Qiraj. This resulted in riots of Stormwind, which ended in the accidental death of the beloved queen Tifin Wrynn, ultimately resulting in the workers being exiled from the city. Now, on to more present times, I think the Defias Brotherhood was one of the few great storylines of Vanilla WoW, and I like how they were pretty much this omnipresent threat which Stormwind was powerless to stop. Even after the original Brotherhood was destroyed, I loved the Westfall storyline in Cataclysm, with Vanessa Van Cleef, the daughter of Edwin Van Cleef, rallying the poor of Stormwind as part of her crusade to avenge her father. In conclusion, while the Defias were not necessarily in the right in their dispute with Stormwind, since both parties were manipulated by Ahn'Qiraj, they are nonetheless the more sympathetic side of the story, and both Edwin and Vanessa are great characters. Number 7 on my list is the Dark Horde, the orcs of Blackrock Mountain who were under the leadership of Rendon Main Blackhand. Now, it's no secret that I prefer the old Horde over the new. Well, the Dark Horde were the survivors of the Second War who refused to surrender and who still fought on under the leadership of the sons of the first war chief, Blackhand. To me, they just seem like this incredibly badass group, desperate and battle-hardened, who were kind of amusingly stuck in a war that ended decades ago. Kind of similar to stories of Japanese veterans of World War II who only find out later that the war had ended. I also liked how the Dark Horde became the puppet of the Black Dragonflight and of Nefarian specifically, and I really liked this combination of Old Horde plus Nefarian's various experiments. I liked the storyline of them contending for the mountain with the Dark Iron Dwarves. I liked Rendon Maim's defiance when they were invited to rejoin Ner'zhul's horde, and I mostly liked their attempt to attack Stormwind during the Cataclysm. So yeah, the Dark Horde. Number 6 on my list is the new Troll Empire, the one forged by the Zandalari following the Cataclysm. Like I mentioned several times before, I love trolls. I love their society, their gods, their culture. I like them. And like I also mentioned previously, I love this archetype of descendants of a fallen empire who are trying to reclaim its past glory. This new Troll Empire is especially interesting to me because it's a union of several extremely desperate tribes, headed by the Zandalari, the most elite among them. In fact, I like the whole situation the Zandalari are now in, ambiguous as it is described, with King Rastakhan's mistake in not trusting the Prophet Zul, causing the destruction of the Zandalari homeland of Zandalar during the Cataclysm. It's unclear in a way if Rastakhan, who has reigned over 200 years, is still the leader of the Zandalari or if he has lost power to Zul. Now, I also really like the relationship between the Zandalari and the tribes that have joined them. The other trolls are viewed as brothers, as comrades, but are nonetheless considered inferior to the Zandalari themselves for more or less valid reasons. Like I also mentioned previously, I also like this contrast between the Zandalari and the Darkspear tribe with Vol'jin, who are arguably closer to the original Troll society, ruled by shadow hunters and with closer ties to the Loa, than the decadent Zandalari, who seem fated to inevitably fall due to their own ambitions. Number 5 on my list is the Bronze Dragonflight. The Bronzes are my favorite Dragonflight. I like their responsibility, their charge, I like their abilities, and I like their attitude, so to say. The storyline of the Bronze Dragons is also a very interesting one, and I'm not necessarily referring just to Nosdormu himself, whom I've talked about many times before, but to the whole Dragonflight, pretty much from the War of the Ancients, with Soridormi having to be the one in charge in Nosdormu's absence, to the War of the Shifting Sands with Anachronos, to the present-day concerns over the infinite Dragonflight and the loss of their ability to control time. The Bronzes arguably have the heaviest responsibility out of all of the Dragonflights, which led to many interesting story arcs, and I especially like how committed they are to the greater good. For instance, even the infinite Dragonflight who seek to destroy and or alter the time ways do so because they believe it is in Azeroth's best interest. While they're usually very elitist, so to say, in their relations with mortals, they're very disconsidering. I nonetheless like the various interactions they have had with the mortal races over the years, from the Watchers they've empowered all the way to the modern situation they are in, where they are forced to depend upon mortals. So yeah, the Bronze Dragonflight. Number 4 on my list is the Kingdom of Quel'Thalas. I like the modern kingdom mostly, which, due to the Scourge invasion, has been drastically reduced in power and in population, and I really like its struggle to not only survive, but to reclaim its lost territory and status in the world. I like the Blood Elves' relationship with the Sunwell and their addiction to magic, and I especially like the relationship between the High Elves and the Blood Elves, with the various attempts at reunification squandered due to the conflict between the Alliance and the Horde. I especially like the leadership of Quel'Thalas and the politics and machinations going on, especially around Lor'themar Farron and his status as undisputed ruler of the Blood Elves, clashing with his personal feelings. Specifically on how he seems content to be Region Lord forever for eternity, despite the fact that there is no one left who actually can become King of Quel'Thalas, and Lor'themar could just start his own dynasty. One thing that I also quite like is the relationship the kingdom has with the Horde and the Alliance, how they transitioned from being betrayed, in their eyes at the very least, by the Alliance, to becoming associates of the Horde, entirely dependent on the goodwill of Sylvanas, to being a power in their own right within the Horde. And I also like the, unfortunately not explored in their entirety, tensions among the population regarding their status as members of the Horde. Many elves remember the destruction the Horde wrought during the Second War, after all. And I especially like the idea, back in patch 5.1, of Lor'themar negotiating with Varian to leave the Horde and rejoin the Alliance, negotiations broken down due to the whole Dalaran debacle. So yeah, a very complicated political landscape, although I would argue not quite as complicated as number 2 on my list. Number 3 on my list are the Knights of the Ebon Blade. I love the storyline of the Knights of the Ebon Blade in Wrath of the Lich King, and I like the idea of Death Knights who are not subservient to the Lich King. I especially love their interaction and relationship with the Argent Crusade, both in Northrend and afterwards, and including in Legion, and how they are very much a ends justifying the means organization, especially considering that, well, they don't really have anything left to lose now, do they? The storyline of the Death Knights in Legion is also a very interesting one, with how they're slowly and unconsciously becoming the pawns of the Lich King again. For that, really, I named them so high on my list. It seems like such an ironic yet fitting continuation of their story following Wrath of the Lich King. Number 2 on my list is the Kingdom of Ironforge. The modern kingdom more so than anything else. I personally really like Dwarf Society, with the division between the Bronzebeards, the Dark Irons and the Wildhammers, but also because of the dwarves themselves. It's also a very interesting political landscape, to say the least, and I also like this current kingdom, this current society, united under the Council of the Three Hammers, but still deeply divided at its core. I like every component part of it, all three clans, and I also like the characters of the aforementioned council. I find it interesting how the old structures of Ironforge, among them the Senate and obviously the Office of the King themselves, have to cope with the situation they are now in, that they have to somehow integrate the Wildhammers and the Dark Iron Dwarves as well. I'm especially curious to see what's going to happen when Moira's son, Dagran, comes to age. He is technically the rightful heir of the Bronzebeards and the Dark Irons. He could in theory form a united monarchy without the need of the Council's assistance. But then as well, that raises the problem of the Wildhammers. The Wildhammers to me seem like an odd sort of third wheel to the Bronzebeard and Dark Iron storyline, introduced mostly so that they're not left out. Now, that's not to say that it's a bad thing that they are part of this new Ironforge. On the contrary, I mean that the introduction of the Wildhammers into the political landscape of the kingdom creates a gigantic complication, since, well, young Dagran has no right to be king over them. At the same time, excluding them would probably be an even worse decision in the long term. You see what I mean? The political landscape of Ironforge is a very complicated and an extremely interesting one, all things considered. The honorable mention on my list are the first generation Death Knights, the ones created by Gul'dan from the souls of orc warlocks infused in human bodies. The reason they're an honorable mention and not an actual part of the list is because, well, they're not really an organization. Sure, they were a somewhat organized unit during the Second War and shortly afterwards, when they were under the command of Tern Gorfiend, but after that, and even during that actually, they weren't really organized enough to be called, well, an organization. Otherwise they would probably be my number 1. I like the first generation Death Knights because of how unique and fearsome they are. They're far more special than the mass-produced, so to say, Death Knights of the Lich King. These are beings of incredible necromantic power, very dark and very fearsome, and they all are really an awesome group of badasses, for lack of a better term. They were one of the most interesting parts of Tides of Darkness and Beyond the Dark Portal, and you can tell how much I like them just by looking at my profile picture. That fellow is named Ragnarok Bloodreaver, and he led a Felorc army in an attempt to overthrow Illidan. And speaking of which... And number 1 is...
Then came Illidan, the one they call the Betrayer, the enemy of my enemy.
Magtheridon lures scores of hapless demons through them daily.
Then we must seal them permanently.
We helped him seal the portals of Outland and cut off the Legion's reinforcements. We fought with renewed strength, and together we reclaimed our sacred ground.
Number 1 on my list are Illidan's forces, mostly referring to the Illidari here, although not exclusively to them. I like much of the same things that I like about the Knights of the Ebon Blade, but the Illidari are a much more hardcore, so to say, version of that. These are people who go through horrific rituals in their obsessive quest to destroy the Burning Legion. I love the various peoples who made up Illidan's forces on Outland, the Fell Orcs, the Naga, the Broken and the Blood Elves, and once again I really like how ends justifying the means Illidan and his forces are. After all, they willingly kidnapped and captured orcs in order to turn them into fel orcs. They enslaved Broken and Lost Ones tribes, not to mention the stuff demon hunters have to go through. And one event that really demonstrates this was at one point during the Illidan novel, where he captures Maiev. He uses the souls of his defeated enemies along with some of Akama's tribe in order to open a portal to the Dreadlord homeworld and to attack it. And I like Illidan and his forces because of that. He's definitely not a good person, he's the ultimate Machiavellian. They fight on the side of the good guys, but they definitely do not share the same morals. And this brings us to the end of another top whatever list. Leave any thoughts in the comments below, and I also wouldn't mind hearing what your favorite organizations or factions or loosely defined groups, so to say, are. So yeah, I'll see you all later and all of that good stuff.